Politics Today by Bianco and Canon, Chapter 10. Congress. Who does Congress represent? As President of the United States, I am asking for a legal solution on DACA, not a political one consistent with the rule of law. The Supreme Court is not willing to give us one now. So now we have to start this process all over again. President Donald Trump. I do not believe we should be granting a path to citizenship to anybody here illegally, Senator Ted Cruz. We can't allow these young people to continue to live in fear, to be at risk. Representative Joe Niguez, Democrat of Colorado. Late in the first year of his presidency, Donald Trump announced that he would end President Obama's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA program. On March 5th, 2018, the program allowed residents who were brought illegally to the United States as children to remain in the country if they had graduated from high school, were currently in school, or who had served in the military and had not committed a felony. President Trump expressed strong support for the program, calling the 700,000 people enrolled incredible kids. However, Trump believed that President Obama had overstepped his authority by creating the program through executive action. So Trump asked Congress to create a legislative solution. In meeting with congressional leaders in early 2018, President Trump said that he would sign whatever compromise on DACA that Congress could agree to. Polls showed that between 73 and 87% of Americans favored allowing the Dreamers as program participants are called to stay and have path up to citizenship. When one would think that enacting a policy that is supported by more than 3/4 of Americans, the president and both parties in Congress, would be a no-brainer. But shortly before the March 5th deadline, the wheels came off. Democrats initially tried to attach DACA bill to a must-pass budget bill. But this effort failed after a 3-day government shutdown. Democrats agreed to a 2-year budget bill 3 weeks later, but without resolution to the DACA issue. In a reversal of his earlier position that he would sign any DACA bill that Congress put forward, President Trump took a hard line against bills that did not include $25 billion in funding for the border wall with Mexico, and that did not replace the lottery program for legal immigration and family-based immigration with a merit-based system. Critics on the far right, such as Senator Ted Cruz, called it amnesty for illegal immigrants, while those in the far left called for a clean bill that addressed only the Dreamers. After Democrats took control of the House in 2019, they passed a bill that would have provided a path to citizenship for 2.3 million undocumented immigrants, including the Dreamers. But the bill was not taken up in the Senate. See what do the facts say on page 316. Given Congress's inability to solve the problem, DACA supporters turned to the courts, which stopped the deportation of the Dreamers. Then in 2020, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that President Trump had not provided legal justification for ending the program, and as a result, he could not disassemble it. The ruling granted a reprieve to the close to 650,000 people in the program who had been brought to the United States as children. On a basic level, this appears to be an example of congressional incompetence and dysfunction. How could a policy with such broad support and positive consequences for the economy not be passed? But it is not unusual for congressional leaders to use a consensual policy such as DACA to help pass more controversial legislation, such as building the wall with Mexico. Some would argue that it is an essential feature of the legislative process. The essential nature of conflict and compromise in the legislative process is not very well understood by the general public. Americans often view the type of wheeling and dealing that is necessary to reach compromises as improper and wonder why there is so much conflict. A typical sentiment is, why does there have to be such a partisan bickering? Can't they just implement the best solutions to our problems? In this chapter, we argue that Congress members' behavior is driven by their desire to respond to the constituents' interest and the closely related goal of re-election, and constrained by the institutional structures within which they operate, such as the committee systems, parties, and leadership. At the same time, members try to be responsible for broader national interests, which are often at odds with their constituents' interest and consequently the goal of re-election. This tension between being responsible and responsive is a source to conflict and requires members of Congress to make tough decisions, often involving political trade-offs and compromises. Should a House member vote for dairy price supports for her local farmers, even if it means higher milk prices for families around the nation? Should a senator vote to subsidize the production of tobacco, the biggest cash crop in his state, despite the tremendous health costs it imposes on millions of Americans? Should a member vote to close a military base as requested by the Pentagon, even if it means the loss of thousands of jobs back home? These are difficult questions. On a complex issue such as immigration, there is no obvious responsible solution and fair-minded people can disagree. The disagreements take on a partisan edge, as most Republicans favor building a stronger border with more limits on legal immigration, while most Democrats do not, which obviously leads to conflict. Why is it so hard for Congress to compromise on issues that appear to be consensual, like protecting the Dreamers? How can members of Congress best serve the collective interests of the nation while also representing their local constituents? Congress and the people. Congress was the first branch early in the nation's history. The Constitution specified for Congress a vast array of enumerated powers, including regulating commerce, coining money, raising and supporting armies, creating the courts, establishing post offices and roads, declaring war, and levying taxes. See Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution in the appendix. The president, in contrast, was given few explicit powers and played a much less prominent role in our history. Furthermore, much of Congress's authority came from its implicit powers, which were rooted in the elastic clause of Article 1 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. The compromise that gave rise to Congress's initial structure reflected an attempt to reconcile the competing interests of the day: large versus small states, northern versus southern states, and proponents of strong national power versus state power. These compromises included establishing a system of bicameralism, that is, a bicameral I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that, two-chambered institution made up of a popularly elected house reflecting the relative power populations of the states, and a Senate chosen by state legislators, representing each state equally, allowing each enslaved person to count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportionment for the House, and setting longer terms for senators, 6 years, than for House members, 2 years. But these compromises also laid the foundation for the split loyalties that members of Congress have. They must respond to both their local constituencies and the nation's interests. Although the founders hoped that Congress would pass legislation emphasizing the national good over local interests, they also recognized the importance of local constituencies. Thus, the relatively short 2-year House term was intended to tie legislators to public sentiment. In general, the founders viewed the state Senate as the more likely institution to speak for the national interests. It was intended to check the more responsive and passionate House. Because senators were indirectly elected and served longer terms than House members, the Senate was more insulated from people. A famous, although maybe fictional, story of an argument between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson points out the differences between the House and Senate. Jefferson did not think the Senate was necessary, while Washington supported having two chambers. During the argument, Jefferson poured some coffee he was drinking into his saucer. Washington asked him why he had done so. "To cool it," replied Jefferson. "Even so," said Washington, "we pour legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it." This idea of a more responsible Senate survived well into the 20th century. Even after the 17th Amendment in 1913 allowed the direct popular election of senators. Today, the Senate is still more insulated than the House. Because of the 6-year terms of the senators, only 1/3 of the 100 Senate seats are contested in each election, while 435 House members are elected every 2 years. However, differences between the House's and Senate's representational roles have become muted, as senators seem to campaign for re-election 365 days a year, every year. Just like House members, this permanent campaign means that senators are now less insulated from electoral forces than they were in the past. The relationship between the president and Congress has also evolved significantly in the 19th century. Congress's roots in geographic constituencies made it well suited for the politics of the time. Although several presidents left their mark on national politics early in U.S. history, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, among others, Congress dominated much of the day-to-day politics, which revolved around issues such as tariff, taxes on imported and exported goods, slavery, and internal improvements such as building roads and canals. Given the tendency to address these issues with patronage and the pork barrel, that is, jobs and policies targeted to benefit specific constituents, Congress was better suited for the delay task of governing than the president was. Beginning around the turn of the 20th century and accelerating with the New Deal of the 1930s, which established modern social welfare and regulatory policies, the scope of the national policy expanded and politics became more centered in Washington. With this nationalization of politics and the increasing importance of national security issues, The president assumed a more central policy-making role. However, the tensions between representing local and national interests remain essential in understanding the legislative process and the relationship between Congress, the members of Congress, and their constituents. I'm going to scroll in on this so that you may read this at your leisure. It's what do the facts say? Congress represents the people, or tries to. Americans have a love-hate relationship with Congress. That is, we generally love our own member of Congress, but we hate Congress as a whole. Well, hate is a strong word, but as we show later in this section, individual members of Congress routinely have approval ratings 30 to 40 points higher than the institutions. One poll found that members of Congress landed third from the bottom in a ranking of 22 professions in terms of perceived honesty and ethical standards, narrowly ahead of car salespeople and lobbyists, nurses, and military officers were at the top. A more whimsical poll by Public Policy Polling asked respondents questions such as, what do you have a higher opinion of, Congress or root canals? Root canals won handily, 56% to 32%. Congress was also less popular than head lice, traffic jams, cockroaches, but narrowly beat out telemarketers and had a comfortable margin over North Korea, the Kardashians, and meth labs. Why is Congress so unpopular? How do members of Congress try to represent their constituents? And how do elections influence this important dynamic? Types of representation. The relationships between the constituents and their member of Congress can be characterized in two basic ways. A both descriptive and substantive. Descriptive representation occurs when members of Congress look alike. Their constituents in demographic or socioeconomic terms. For example, are members African American, Latino, or white, male or female, Catholic, Protestant, or some other religion, middle class or upper class? Many people believe that this kind of representation is a distinct value in itself. Having positive role models for various demographic groups helps create greater trust in the system. Moreover, constituents benefit from being represented by someone who shares something as basic as their skin color. Descriptive representation is also related to the perceived responsiveness of a member of Congress. In general, constituents report higher levels of satisfaction with representatives who are of the same racial or ethnic background. If you doubt that descriptive representation makes a difference, ask yourself whether it would be fair if all 435 House members and 100 senators were white male Protestants. Although the demographics of Congress are considerably more diverse than this, the legislature does not come close to looking like us. On a nationwide scale, see What Do the Facts Say feature on page 318. More important than members' race, gender, or religion, many people argue, is the substance of what the person does. Substantive representation involves how the member serves his or her constituents' interest. Two long-standing models of this kind of representation are the trustee, who represents the constituents' interest from a distance, weighing numerous national, collective, local, and moral concerns, and two, the delegate, who carries out the direct desires of the voters. In a sense, trustees are more concerned with being responsible, and delegate are more interested in being responsive. Trustees, by definition, will do what they think is in the best long-term interest of their constituents and the nation, even though it may mean voting against their constituents' immediate wishes and risking defeat in the next election. Delegates, in contrast, do not have to worry about angering voters because they simply do what their constituents want. Truth be told, the trustee-delegate distinction is mostly important as a theoretical point of departure for talking about representation roles. Nearly all members of Congress act like trustees in some circumstances and like delegates in others. A third model of representation captures this reality. The politico is more likely to act as a delegate on issues that are especially important to his or her constituency, such as immigration, reform, or farm subsidies, but as a trustee on less salient or very complex issues, such as some foreign policies. Therefore, the crucial component of representation is the nature of the constituency and how the members of Congress attempts to balance and represent constituents, conflicting needs and desires. This is what the facts say. I will scroll in close. Hopefully I can get all the text for there you go. And you can see the graph chart here. The role of the constituency. Most voters do not monitor their representatives' behavior closely. Can representation work if voters are not paying attention? Members of Congress behave as if voters are paying attention. We're paying attention, even when constituents are inattentive. Incumbents know that at election time, the challengers may raise issues that become important after the public thinks about them. So they try to deter challengers by anticipating what the constituents would want if they were fully informed. For example, the public hadn't thought much about voting by mail, but it became an issue in the 2020 election when the COVID-19 pandemic forced many states to cut down on person voting. President Trump claimed that voting by mail was an effort by Democrats to steal the election, while many states argued that it was a way to protect voters from being exposed to the virus. Savvy incumbents would have tried to stake out a position constituent with what the voters would want before a strong challenger raised the issue in a campaign. Another way to examine representative constituency relationship to look at differences across districts. How do the districts vary? First, they differ in size. Senate districts, that is states, vary in terms of both area and population. House districts all have about 760,000 people, but they vary tremendously in geographic size. From Alaska's 663,000 square miles to New York's 13th district with 10.25 miles. Second districts also differ in terms of who lives there and what they want from government. Because districts are so faceted, the legislators they elect different from one another as well. Regardless of the office, most voters want to elect someone whose policy positions are close to theirs. As a result, legislators tend to reflect the central tendencies of their districts. At one level, electing a legislator that thinks like America sounds good. If legislators act and think like their districts, then the legislators will contain a good mixture of the interests representing the country or state. But this often makes finding compromise difficult. We elect legislators to get things done, but they may be able to agree on anything because they're disagreements. are too fundamental to bridge. For example, the country is sharply divided on abortion rights, as are the House, the Senate, and most legislators. The fact that legislators have not come to a decision on the issue is no surprise. Just as citizens disagree, so do their elected representatives. Despite the vast differences among congressional constituencies, voters nationwide want many of the same things: a healthy economy, a safe country in terms of national defense and local crime, good schools, and effective and affordable health care. Figure 10.1 reports responses to survey about how citizens feel that legislators should do their jobs. The survey shows tensions between being a delegate and trustee. Respondents want their representatives to vote for what the people they represent want and spend more time at home, and they show little interest in having their representatives spend more time in Washington. Thus, responsibilities for national interest may be more difficult for members of Congress to explain their constituents. Here's figure 10.1. So I'll try and zoom out so that you can see that. Oops, sorry about that. I was hoping you'd be able to read that in the graph, sorry. Members of Congress want to keep their jobs. Members' relationships to their constituents also must be understood within the context of their desire to be reelected. Political scientist David R. Mayhew argues that members of Congress are single-minded seekers of reelection. Members certainly hold multiple goals, including making good policy, but if they cannot maintain their seats, then they cannot attain the other goals while in office. After assuming that re-election is central, Mayhew asked this question: members of Congress may be electorally motivated, but they are in a position to do anything about it. Although individual members of Congress cannot do much to alter national, economic, or political forces that may affect voters' choices, they can control their own activities in the House or Senate. The importance of the electoral connection in explaining members' behavior seems especially clear for marginal incumbents who are constantly trying to shore up their electoral base. But even incumbents in safe districts realize that their job security is not guaranteed. Mayhew outlines 3 ways that members of Congress promote their chances for re-election: advertising, credit claiming, and position taking. Each approach shapes the way members relate to their constituents. Advertising in this context refers to appeals or appearances without issue, content that get members' name in front of the public and in a favorable way. Advertising includes working the district, such as attending town meetings, appearing in a parade, or sending letters to congratulation for graduation, birthdays, or anniversaries. Members of Congress also spend a fair amount of time meeting with constituents in Washington, D.C., including seeing school groups, tourists, and interest groups from their districts. In credit claiming, the members of Congress takes credit for something of value to voters, most commonly pork barrel policies targeted to benefit specific constituents or the district as a whole. Another source of credit claiming is casework for individual constituents who request help with tasks such as tracking down a lost Social Security check or expediting the process of a passport. This activity, like advertising, has both district-based and Washington-based components. Position taking refers to any public statement such as roll call, vote, speech, editorial, or position paper about a topic of interest to constituents or interest groups. This may be the toughest aspect of a member's job because on many issues, the member is likely to alienate a certain segment of population no matter what position he or she takes. Members try to appeal to specific audiences within their district. For example, while speaking to the veterans of foreign wars, members might emphasize their support for particular new weapons program, but in meetings with college students, they might highlight their opposition to the NSA's collection of millions of phone records. Representatives' focus on re-election has some costs, two of which reflect widespread public opinion. First, the perception that Congress has granted itself to many special privileges aimed at securing re-election, such as funding for large staffs and the privilege of sending mail at no cost, leads to harsh criticism. Second, there is concern that members' time spent actively campaigning takes time away from the responsibilities of enacting laws and overseeing their implementation. Another cost is the possibility of passing contradictory policies in an effort to satisfy diverse interest groups. The desire to be reelected influences House members and senators' behavior both in the district and in Congress, as we have mentioned. Incumbents look for opportunities to shore up support for the next election, and their success at pleasing constituents produces large election rewards. As Figure 10.2 shows, few members are defeated in re-election races. This is known as the incumbency advantage. In the past 2 decades, incumbent re-election rates have been near record high levels, with 95 to 98% of House incumbents winning. For example, in 2008, in an election that many called transformational, 94% of House incumbents were still re-elected. Even in the tsunami election of 2010, in which Republicans made the largest gains in the House since 1948, picking up 63 seats, 86% of incumbents were re-elected. In the 2018 midterm, in which Democrats picked up 41 seats and regained control of the House, 91% of the incumbents were re-elected. Why are incumbents so successful? Scholars have offered several reasons for this incumbency advantage. In the district home style, one explanation for the increasingly incumbency advantage is rooted in the diversity of congressional districts and states. Members of Congress typically respond to the diversity in their districts by developing an appropriate home style, a way of relating to the district. A home style shapes the way members allocate resources, the way incumbents present themselves to their district, and the way they explain their policy positions. Given the variation among districts, members' home styles vary as well. In some rural districts, it is important for representatives to have local roots, and voters expect extensive contact with members. Urban districts expect a different kind of style. Because they have a more mobile population, voters are Voters there expect less direct contact and place more emphasis on how their elected members of Congress explain their policy positions. Incumbency advantage may be explained in part by the skill with which members have cultivated their individual home styles in the last 2 decades. Members spend more time at home and less time in Washington than was true a generation ago. This familiarity with voters has helped them remain in office. Table 10.1 shows how one member of Senator Tammy Baldwin spent her time in Washington and in her district as a House member before running for the Senate. I will zoom in on figure 10.2. See if I can get close enough so that you may read this. Hopefully you were able to have your book. And then I will kind of zoom in so that you can kind of read that. If I turn it sideways, it shows up sideways on the video, so I don't know how I can do that part, but at least you'll get the basic paragraph. Campaign fundraising. Raising money is also likely key to staying in office. Incumbents need money to pay for campaign staff, traveling, and advertising. It takes at least $1 million to make a credible challenge to an incumbent. In most districts and in many areas with expensive media markets, the minimum price tag is $2 million or more. Few challengers can raise that much money. The gap between incumbent and challenger spending has grown dramatically in the past decade. With incumbents now spending about 3 times as much as challengers, incumbents have far greater potential to raise vast sums of money, in part because PACs are unwilling to risk alienating incumbent by donating to challengers. However, for the first time ever, Senate challengers outspent incumbents in 2020, but only 3 of them won. For more on campaign finance, see chapters 8 and 9. Money also functions as a deterrent to potential challengers. A sizable re-election fund signals that an incumbent knows how to raise money and will run a strong campaign. The aim is to convince would-be challengers that they have a slim chance of beating the incumbent, and to convince contributors and party organizations that there's no point in trying to support a challenger. This point is crucial in explaining incumbency advantage because it is nearly impossible for a weak challenger to beat an incumbent. Consider that only 10 to 15% of challengers in a typical election year have any previous elective experience. When such a high proportion of challengers are amateurs, it is not surprising that so many incumbents win. Here's table 10.1. At least that one you can kind of, hopefully it's not blurry enough, but at least you can pause it and read it. Constituency service. Another thing incumbents do to get reelected is work their districts. Taking every opportunity to meet with constituents, listen to their concerns, and perform casework. Helping constituents interact with government programs or agencies. High levels of constituency service may help explain why some incumbents have become electorally secure. Members of Congress love doing constituency service because it is an easy way to make voters happy. If a member can help a constituent solve a problem, that person will be more likely to support the member in the future. Many voters might give the incumbent some credit simply for being willing to listen. Therefore, most members devote a significant portion of their staff to constituency service, publish newsletters that tout their good deeds on behalf of constituents, and solicit citizens' requests for help through their newsletters and websites. The combination of factors gives incumbents substantial advantages over candidates who might run against them. By virtue of their position, they can help constituents who have problems with an agency or a problem. They attract media attention because of their actions in office, and they use their official position as a platform for raising campaign cash. Finally, most incumbents represent states or districts whose partisan balance, the number of likely supporters of their party versus the number likely to prefer the other party, is skewed in their favor. If it weren't there, they probably wouldn't have won the seat in the first place. I am tongue twisted today. Redistricting connects representation and elections. The shape and makeup of congressional districts are critical to understanding representation in Congress and the electoral connection. District boundaries determine who is eligible to vote in any given congressional race, and these boundaries are redrawn every 10 years. After each national census, redistricting is usually the task of state legislators. Its official purpose is to ensure that districts are roughly equal in population, which in turn ensures that every vote counts equally in determining the composition of the legislature. The decennial process placed additional significance in state elections in 2020, as control over redistricting as at stake. Final results were not available as this addition went to process, but it appears that Republicans picked up control of a net of 2 state legislative chambers and 2 governorships, and now have unified control in 23 states. Democrats control 15 state governments, and 12 states have split control. District populations vary over time as people move from state to state or from one part of a state to another. At the national level, states gain or lose legislative seats after each census through a process called apportionment, which is the process of dividing the fixed number of House seats, 435, among the states based on increases and decreases in state populations. Thus, states growing the fastest gain seats, and states that are not growing as fast lose seats. For example, after the 2010 census, Texas gained 4 seats in Congress while Ohio lost 2. After the 2020 census, Texas is projected to pick up the 3 seats. Florida will gain 2 seats, and at least 15 more seats will gain or lose a single seat. The one legislator in America that is not redistricted is the U.S. Senate, which has 2 legislators per state. Voters in small states thus have a proportionally more influence than those in large states when it comes to the Senate. In theory, redistricting proceeds from a set of principles that define what districts should look like. One criterion is the districts should be roughly equal in population based on the principles of one person, one vote. Established by the Supreme Court with Baker versus Carr in the 1960s, they should also reflect communities of interest by grouping like-minded voters in the same district. There are also technical criteria, including compactness. Districts should not have extremely bizarre shapes and contiguously. One part of a district cannot be completely separated from the rest of the district. Map makers also try to respect traditional natural boundaries, avoid splitting municipalities, preserve existing districts, and avoid diluting the voting power of racial minorities. Partisan redistricting. Although the preceding principles are important, they are not the driving force in the redistricting process.
Suppose a Democrat holds a House seat from an urban district populated mainly by citizens with strong Democratic Party ties. After a census, the Republican-dominated state legislature develops a new plan that extends the representatives district into the suburbs, claiming that the change counteracts declines within the city by adding suburban voters. However, these suburban voters will likely be Republicans, thus increasing the chance that Democrat will face strong opposition in future elections and lose his or her seat. Such changes have an important impact on voters as well. Voters who are shifted to a new district by a change in boundaries may be unable to vote for the incumbent they have supported for years and may instead get a representative who doesn't share their views. In congressional redistricting, a reduction in the number of seats allocated to a state can lead to districting plans that put two incumbents in the same district, forcing them to run against each other. Incumbents from one party use these opportunities to defeat incumbents from the other party. Both parties use this technique and other tools of creative cartography to gain partisan advantage. Attempts to use the redistricting process for political advantages are called gerrymandering. The term is named after Eldridge Gerry, an early Massachusetts House member and governor, vice president under James Madison, and author of the original partisan redistricting plan in 1812, including a district with a thin, winding shape resembling a salamander. While partisan motivations have produced some funny-looking districts, see Nuts and Bolts 10.1. For examples of a partisan gerrymander and redistricting strategies, the courts have allowed the practice to continue until recently, more than 30 years ago. The Supreme Court ruled that partisan gerrymandering may be unconstitutional, but over the next 3 decades, the court struggled to find a standard that allowed it to distinguish between partisan bias so extreme that it violated the Constitution and normal partisan politics. Here's types of gerrymandering. So you may read, hopefully you can see that. I'll kind of zoom in on this side so that you can, these are types of gerrymandering. Those are partisans, and this is racial. Then from 2016 through 2018, a flood of litigation in federal and state courts showed, judges' increasing willingness to rule that parties had gone too far in their redistricting plans. Sophisticated mapping programs and access to detailed political data allowed parties to slice and dice districts with increasing precision, yielding partisan maps that were no longer acceptable to the courts. In Wisconsin, North Carolina, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, federal and state courts struck down state legislative and congressional maps that they ruled to be unfairly partisan. See Take a Stand feature for more on the debate of on this topic. However, in 2018, the Supreme Court took up cases from North Carolina and Maryland that concluded that partisan gerrymandering claims present political questions beyond the reach of the federal courts because they lacked a limited and precise standard for evaluating the extent of partisan bias. While recognizing that partisan gerrymandering may reasonably seem unjust and is incompatible with democratic principles, the court left it up to states to resolve this problem. Justice Kagan issued a scathing dissent, writing, "For the first time ever, this court refuses to remedy a constitutional violation because it thinks the task beyond judicial capabilities. Of all times, to abandon the court's duty to declare the law. This was not the one. The practices challenged in these cases imperial our system of government. Part of court's role in that system is to defend its foundations. None is more important than free and fair elections. Racial redistricting. Redistricting may yield boundaries that look highly unusual, especially when such efforts address population groups based on race. During the 1992 redistricting in North Carolina, the Justice Department told state legislators that they needed to create 2 districts with majority populations of minority voters, called a majority-minority district. Figure 10.3 shows the plan that legislator enacted, in which the district boundaries look like a pattern of spider webs and ink blots. Moreover, one of the districts had parts that ended up being only as wide as I-85, following their highway off an exit ramp, over a bridge, and down the entrance ramp on the other side. This move prevented the I-85 district from bisecting the district it was traveling through, which would have violated the state law requiring contiguous districts. I'll zoom in on this. This is figure 10.3. This is North Carolina. And then what I'll do is zoom in here so that you can pause this. This is Take a Stand. So that you may pause this and read this. The North Carolina example shows how convoluted redistricting plans can become. Part of the complexity is due to the availability of census databases that enable line drawers to divide voters as closely as they want, moving neighborhood by neighborhood, even house by house. Why bother with this level of detail? Because redistricting influences who gets elected, it is active politicking, and because I don't know what my deal in its most fundamental form. The North Carolina plan was ultimately declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Shaw versus Reno, a ruling that opened the door for dozens of lawsuits about racial redistricting. See the discussion in Chapter 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And more recent Supreme Court rulings on racial redistricting, especially in the 2013 case, in which the court struck down the part of the law that identified states that needed to have their redistricting plans pre-approved by the Justice Department. The current legal standard is that race cannot be a predominant factor in drawing congressional district lines, but it can be one of the factors. The responsiveness dilemma. As mentioned earlier, polls show that despite generally approving of their own member of Congress, people hold Congress itself in very low esteem. This is rooted in the conflicts that rise from Congress's dual roles: responsibility for national policy making and responsiveness to local constituencies. Part of the national frustration with Congress arises because we want our representatives to be both responsible and responsive. We want them to be great national leaders and to take care of our local and, at times, personal concerns. Rather than understanding these issues as inherent in the legislative process, we often accuse members of gridlock and partisan bickering when our conflicting demands are not met. For example, public opinion polls routinely show that the public wants lower taxes, more spending on education, the environment, and health care, and balanced budgets. But those three things cannot happen simultaneously. We often expect the impossible from Congress and then are frustrated when it doesn't happen. The responsiveness dilemma brings us back to the puzzle we posed at the beginning of this section. Why is there a persistent 30 to 40% gap between approval ratings for individual members and for the institution? The answer may simply be that members of Congress tend to respond more to the constituents' demands than to take on the responsibility of solving national problems. And when Congress becomes embroiled in debates about constituencies' conflicting demands, the institution may appear ineffectual. But as long as the members keep the folks back home happy, their individual popularity will remain high. The structures of Congress. As we have seen, the goal of re-elected greatly influences the behaviors of Congress, members of Congress. The re-election goal has a strong influence on the way that Congress is structured, both formally, staff, the committee systems, parties, and leadership roles, and informally, norms. Despite the importance of the electoral connection, the goal of being re-elected cannot explain everything about members' behavior and the congressional structure. This section examines some other explanations that underlie the informal and formal structures of Congress, the policy motivations of members, the partisan basis for congressional institutions, and the importance of the committee system. Informal structures. Various norms provide an informal structure for the way that Congress works. Universalism is the norm that when benefits are divided up, they should be awarded to as many districts and states as possible. Thus, for example, when it comes to handing out federal highway dollars to expenditures for the Pentagon's weapons programs, the benefits are broadly distributed across the entire country. This means, however, that votes on such bills tend to be lopsided, as some areas of the country need the federal funds more urgently than others. Another norm, log rolling, reinforces universalism with the idea that if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. This norm leads members of Congress to support bills that they otherwise might oppose in exchange for other members' votes on bills that are very important to them. For example, House members from a dairy state might vote for tobacco price supports, even if their state has no tobacco farmers. And in return, they would expect a member from the tobacco state to vote for the dairy price support bill. This norm can produce a wasteful pork barrel spending. In the 2011 budget, a $1.1 trillion omnibus appropriations bill contained more than 6,488 earmarks, worth $8.3 billion. So nearly everyone gained something by passing it. The $1.4 trillion 2020 omnibus appropriations bill did not include any traditional earmarks, or pork as they are informally known. Following the ban on informal earmarks, both the House and the Senate in 2011, but there were still billions of dollars in targeted spending as members of Congress found ways to secure funding for their district or state. Representative Jim Banks, Republican of Indiana, complained about the wasteful spending in the sprawling bill, saying that, like mystery meat, you don't want to know what's in it. Also, like mystery meat, you can be at least one ingredient as a whole lot of pork. The norm of specialization is also important, both for the efficient operation of Congress and for members' re-election. By specializing and becoming an expert on a given issue, members provide valuable information to the institution as a whole and also create a basis for credit claiming. This norm is stronger in the House, where members often develop a few areas of expertise, whereas senators tend to be policy generalists. The seniority norm also serves individual and institutional purposes. This norm holds that the member with the longest service on a given committee chair that committee, although there have been numerous violations of this norm whereby the most senior member has been passed over for someone whom the party leaders favored. The norm benefits the institution by ensuring orderly succession in committee leadership. The norm also benefits members by providing a tangible reason why voters should return them to Congress year after year. I am going to stop here because this is a different section. So this is the end of chapter 10, part 1. And hopefully I will get my mouth together. I am so sorry about my tongue tied.